Hello, I'm David DeCosmo. Welcome to ECTV Live. My co-host Rusty Fender joins me today, and Rusty, what a treat! One of your former colleagues in the radio industry.
We worked forever together, and folks still a couple years later will come up and say, you know, the best part of all the things we've done on the air, will come up and say, you know, I miss the banter between you and Steve Corbett, of course, the Times leader, WILK Radio. You know, we turned a 10-second traffic update into a 15-minute segment about cereals they don't make, sodas they don't make, Rocky Glen, and all the things that people want to talk about.
And I never knew what was happening on the highways. So we
I mean, that's beside the point there, Dave, but...
In any case, my friend, Steve Corbett joins us. Steve, you know, when I introduce someone here, and I like to say, well, they're the superintendent of this, they manage such and such, we would probably take half the show just to give credit to Steve,
right.
Because I think I met Steve first when he was a columnist for the Times Leader, I believe.
But
Steve.
It's Irish-American, outlaw, gangster novelist, and Hill section resident.
And literary figure.
How about that? Okay.
Absolutely.
I got almost them all.
Absolutely. Outlaw novelist is really what best serves the purpose. And our banter that people talked about, that was a way to segue into the real news, to segue into the real nuts and bolts of northeastern Pennsylvania,
the hard stuff.
U.S., and the world.
Hard, cold country.
Hard, cold country indeed. But what I'm doing now is stepping away from journalism on a daily basis. I'm no longer tethered to a newsroom. I'm no longer bound to a radio station. I am indeed an outlaw novelist. So when I got fired the last time, I stepped into a role where I decided the books I've always wanted to write needed to be written. I've always been influenced by some great newspaper columnists who were novelists. Pete Hamill, Jimmy Breslin, Pete Dexter, who worked at the Philadelphia Daily News and went on to become a great, great novelist. Steve Lopez, who's still a columnist at the LA Times. Steve and I have been in contact. Steve Lopez, also a great novelist. So I'm able to take the issues that I always addressed as mostly a newspaper columnist, almost 20 years at the Times Leader, 17 years, and a decade on the radio in the world of so-called news talk radio. I'm able to address those issues on a bigger scale. So the novel that I have coming out in October is called Blood Red Syrah. Syrah, a kind of wine. The book is what I categorize as a gruesome California wine country thriller. But all the issues that I've addressed over the years, whether it be issues of racism, of classism, of sexism, substance abuse, mental illness, violence, all these issues play a role in this story, which is essentially the search for truth, which is what journalism has to be.
Should be.
And the search for enlightenment, which is really what our lives should be.
And your setting for the novel is California.
It's California.
And Steve has an extensive background there, having worked. I believe you covered the Michael Jackson trial.
I did. We moved to the central coast of California, Santa Barbara County, Santa Maria, in 2002.
And still visit there every year as well.
We're there
Absolutely.
every year. I'll get to that shortly. We made good, dear friends there. We had great adventures there. I wrote newspaper columns for a lousy little daily paper. My job was to spread truth and light on the frontier, like Zorro. And I did just that. But I got to the point where I was a prisoner of paradise. I had an avocado tree in my front yard. There was too much sunshine, not good for anybody. And I had to come home to the hard, cold country and the gray, gritty skies and sidewalks of my hometown,
and you were
where I
born,
have 5 generations. I
locally.
was not born locally.
You weren't
I
born
was
locally.
born of a Pennsylvania Dutch German mother in York, Pennsylvania. My father, Seamus, right here in the Manuka section of Scranton. I got 5 generations in Scranton at this point. Never lived here until I came back from paradise, and I wanted to be in Scranton.
And you know, since I met you, although you were doing newspaper column at the time, I always thought of you as a novelist because you had done some You had done some writing before.
Oh, I had dabbled in a number of genres, but never had anything published. I was a newspaper columnist. That's all I ever wanted to be, a newspaper columnist, and a good one. I wanted to be an insurrectionist. I wanted to use words to foment revolution, to provoke people to think, to take action, to confront the status quo, including the media bosses who have become so weak-kneed and milquetoasty that it's a bad, sloppy breakfast for anybody to start their day.
Well, it's, you know how I feel
It's true.
about.
That's true.
I'll be 60 years in the media in 2019, and I can remember the days when we'd go in, we'd gather our facts from as many sources as possible. We'd stand in front of a camera and we would tell our story, and we didn't have a smartphone
You're right.
or a teleprompter in front of us.
Now when you see a reporter trip up on the air with their phone, they have it recorded and they're listening to what they have just said and they're repeating it, and then they get tripped out and they pull their earphone out. No one could even convey a complete thought without their iPhone.
I learned to be a journalist on a typewriter. And I first had to teach myself how to type.
Me too.
I had to teach
Absolutely.
myself how
Me
to type.
too.
But I did
Me
that.
too.
And I wrote stories for weeklies. I was in Harrisburg when I started writing for a weekly paper. And I wrote for free, and I wrote for $5. And I didn't get a daily newspaper job until I was 34 years old. I wanted to fight my way in. I had to fight my way to stay there. And then ultimately, I fought my way out as well. And it's the only way to fly. Too many journalists are lazy. Too many journalists won't take risks. They don't want to sacrifice. I used to tell people, and I don't say this lightly at all, that people die for the First Amendment.
Oh, yeah.
And they die regularly for the First Amendment.
Still
and
happens.
This is a sacred
Yeah.
calling.
Right. Still
Absolutely.
right.
All you got to
Yeah.
do is go to
Absolutely.
Annapolis and take a look at the people who were murdered in the newsroom.
Yeah, that's right.
So what I'm looking for in terms of journalism is aggressive, pointed journalism. And keep in mind, as a newspaper columnist, I was a good reporter, but I took sides. A columnist draws conclusions from the facts, and often I uncovered those facts. And now I watch them, and they know who they are, those who are the clerks of fact, like their stenographers, or those who have some guts, those who will buck the system, those who will sacrifice to bring truth into the lives of the people who depend on them. And that's why journalism and the First Amendment so important.
Well,
not the enemy of the people.
And in fairness, those in the field have a lot going against them too these days. And I think the prime example of that is the fact that local ownership is, for the most part, gone.
Absolutely. That's a big point.
It's a corporate system.
Yeah, you no longer work for the Baltimores at WBRE, the McGargies at WDAU,
Roy Morgan at
Roy Morgan at
WYLK, yeah.
WYLK.
Here's the difference. Here's the difference when a college and a university goes from calling students scholars to calling them customers. You recognize what we're up against. So when we have newspaper publishers and radio station program directors and managers and vice presidents who go from considering themselves to be media people who understand news and nothing more than salesmen and saleswomen, we've got major problems in this search for truth.
And you've got also the situation where we've evolved to a state where those, and I don't want to make a blanket and
No, be specific. There are enough of them out there to point the finger at.
well, what I'm driving at is we're getting these reporters out of colleges who are learning from professors who now, at this stage, have not had any field experience.
exactly right.
In the novel, in
Exactly.
Blood Red Surratt, my protagonist is a guy named Jesus Zarate, and he's a newspaper columnist on the Central Coast. At a made-up paper, the Santa Maria Mirror. And Jesus Zarate sees what we're talking about. And Jesus Zarate, in the search for truth, in the quest to take the side of what is right and what is good, Jesus Zarate loses his job. But that doesn't stop him. That doesn't stop his own crusade, his own pilgrimage to continue to learn and live and take the side to help people who need help, something all good citizens must do. So my protagonist is a newspaper columnist. But I also have so many other people who reflect what I learned during the almost 5 years. I lived and worked on the Central Coast in California. And we talk about so many issues in the book that have to be addressed, and they're rough. It's a rough ride. Violence has to be described very clearly to be understood. Racism has to be experienced on that printed page to decide what's so wrong and bad about it. Abuse of women has to be addressed, and this book is a very stark look at reality, whether it be on the central coast of California or whether it be right here in northeastern Pennsylvania. The very issues that I made a point of addressing, that all too often are not addressed in our community, I address now in a novel that's going to be available worldwide. We're dropping this book. It'll be available for sale October 1st. We've got a website coming. We will have video. We will have music. We will have everything attached to the marketing of this book, Blood Red Syrah, and hopefully people will read it and think and apply those lessons to their own lives.
Let me tell you an interesting story, first of all. This is a Corbett story. When you took over the show at WILK, which was predominantly a syndicated program before that, they have very little interest, the Rush Limbaughs, the Sean Hannitys and all that. Corbett came in with this new news philosophy in the area before that, and now we're back to this because the broadcast pendulum swings. We're back to we're back to 4 hours of talk shows now about call in and tell us what your favorite ice cream cone is. Does the spool of toilet paper go over or under the spool? Like, this is the lame, limp talk that we're used to. Corbett came in. And this, I've heard of him, of course, 20 years at the Times Leader before that when he came in, did this big campaign. They had Corbett standing bareback with his back toward the photo, and it has Corbett's back. And it was the back of Corbett, Corbett's back. Great campaign.
You can see my Buddha tattoo on my shoulder,
I could see those sun freckles, too, which was far too much information. Nonetheless, in this made ratings, Arbitron, which is now Nielsen, Arbitron history, this man, in 6 months, and it usually takes a year to stabilize, took that time slot from 3 in the afternoon until 7 o'clock at night, up 550%.
Wow.
Never before been done in the United States ratings in that area. Because this man came in and didn't do radio before, but knew from the paper how to promote. I got 3 judges and they're going to jail, and I'm going to tell you who they are right after this commercial break. And you better listen. And everybody did. And it's amazing that now you go back to this where we started out. And it's true. Things do go back and forth now to this lame, limp, just blah, blah. It's like Queen. All we hear is radio goo-goo, radio gaga.
Well, you get an issue that's been that's hit the headlines. And obviously, the bulk of a program today is a reaction to those headlines.
Correct.
I come from a time when, probably 1964, when I did a talk show in Berwick. But at that time, we were not permitted to give our opinion. It was, here's the issue, what do you think about it?
But see, that's where people don't really understand what journalism is.
That's right.
I've often said, there's a Pulitzer Prize given for commentary.
There is.
What is commentary other than opinion?
You should take a stand. You should take a stand. That's right, you should take a stand.
I always have and I always will. But too many people believe that they know everything there is to know about every issue.
Yeah.
Journalism is an almost all-encompassing experience, but there are real good journalists and there are real lousy journalists.
Sure.
And all too often, what's bad passes for good. And all too often, the fear factor gets the money men and money women upset so that they panic. They're too timid. They don't understand what's at stake here until something hits them in their own home, in their own lives, and then often it's too late.
Right.
How much of your northeastern Pennsylvania experience are you able to put in to a novel-based setting in California?
It's very easy. All the issues are the same. The issues I've referenced,
So the climate's the only change.
whether they be mental illness, whether they be substance abuse. Think of all the issues in this community that stem from people who are not treated for mental illness. This addiction problem we have, including our old-fashioned addiction problem, the killer alcohol. Don't forget that. the issues of violence, of domestic abuse, the issues that rise in racism, in white nationalism, the use of marijuana medically, recreationally. All this relates to northeastern Pennsylvania, and it's all addressed in this book in California as well. These are the international issues, but they're national issues. They're American issues. It's what will cause us to fail and continue to flounder unless we address those issues, and the press has one of the biggest responsibilities, as do the people. I have faith in the people as long as they do their work. You've got to work. It's not easy to read and to think and to take action. It takes guts. If you're willing to do that, we'll be better off. If you're not willing to do that, we rest on the precipice of failure.
Yeah, and we go back to what I brought up before about the mega ownerships of broadcasting. That was, you come right down to it, the public allowed it to happen.
It's like fast food.
That's right.
Yeah, nobody raised any red flags.
It's easy. It's easy to just pick up a USA Today even and read the news McNuggets. It's more difficult and time consuming, and you need to make a commitment to learn, to teach yourself, so you can be a good role model if that's important to you. It is to me.
I say this all the time. We go back to 1984. I was in charge of engineering at the World Trade Center for AT&T. To think, and we just talked about this a couple of weeks ago, Dave, to think that the country was in absolute uproar about the AT&T Bell breakup.
Oh, yeah.
This can't happen. This is impossible. A long-distance carrier owns the local phone company. This is outrageous. This is antitrust. This is unbelievable. And now one company runs the world.
But this is
have we learned anything from this?
Yes, I've learned. And I've learned as somebody who's getting older, as we all are. I'm 67 years of age. The people I think about in reading my book, this first novel, Blood Red Syrah, are younger people. I don't believe my book is going to appeal as much to the baby boomers as it will appeal to those who are a little edgier, a little more inclined to take a risk, a little freakier, a little more tattooed. This is why we're going to drop this book at a launch party during a First Friday event here in downtown Scranton on October 5. So I invite everybody. The details will be available as the time draws near. But I invite everybody to come out. And creativity has to be encouraged. That's why younger people, whether they're in metal bands, whether they're getting tattoos, whether they're engaged in art to find themselves and the muse that drives them, that's what we need to do. When you get boring, as an older person, you're boring, and you don't do anybody any good, including yourself. So I don't want anybody to ever accuse me of being a bore, and I don't want anybody to ever accuse me of not having that glint, that spark that ignites, that puts me on the razor's edge. That's where I want to live.
Do you miss doing the radio show?
No, not at all.
Really?
Wasteland.
Because you can certainly vocalize more than you can behind a Smith Corona typewriter or whatever.
It's a different medium.
It is,
Yeah,
isn't it?
totally,
It
totally.
is.
Reading,
It
reading
really is.
takes you deeper.
I know, that's right.
Reading
Yeah.
takes you deeper. And
is.
reading can be scary because you have to experience what those emotions are that the writer
Yeah.
wants to provide you to experience.
Pardon me.
Reading is an art in and of itself.
And I have always said that a good journalist on the air can sell newspapers.
Absolutely.
Because radio and television is automatically restricted by time constraints that the printed word
That's right.
can go much deeper, much further. So if I'm giving you, I have the ability to break the story. You have the ability to go far deeper into
Yeah,
that
but
story.
I have
Corbett.
broken more than my share
That's right.
of stories, news stories, than most straight up and down
You
reporters.
were
That's
also
that's because
you were
things have
also
changed.
lucky too. You came along at the right place at the right time, which is my mantra in life: the right place at the right time,
Yeah.
where you could break a story locally. Now, if you try that, they'll say, "Please, we lost a sponsor. Just talk about what
I
your
was
favorite breed
fortunate-
of dog is."
I was very fortunate.
That's right.
When I came to Wilkes-Barre.
That's right.
Because I was 34 years old. I had already created all kinds of issues in Harrisburg with weeklies, including being cited for harassment during an incident in a bar room with the mayor of Harrisburg. He's convicted of political crimes now, by the way. And when I came to Wilkes-Barre, I had bosses who understood what a newspaper columnist really needed to be. They actually had one, a guy named Hank Pearson, who's dead now. And Hank knew what a newspaper columnist needed to be. And I held my breath, but Dale Duncan was there. Dale Duncan, one of the best newspaper people in the world. Cliff Sheckman, another one. There to not only encourage me, but to support me when the advertisers started to squeal, when the other editors and maybe some reporters who might have been a little envious of the freedom that I fought to gain for myself and for the readers became obvious. But either you do it or you don't. And now there's too much timidity. There's too much of this please, please, please. And I'm not talking to James Brown, son.
It's the bottom line. You lose an advertiser, knee-jerk reaction.
Oh,
Steve,
it's terrible, isn't it?
just stick to the
Well,
favorite flavor of ice cream, Steve. It's ridiculous.
Let's go back to some of the basics again and admit to ourselves that from the radio point of view, journalism is almost dead because you don't have the local outlets that have news now.
Absolutely.
Television, a step up, a step better, but again, multi-station ownership and things. But I'm curious about something. You have such deep experience with such dramatic local happenings. I have to wonder why you just didn't say, let me write a book about all these things here in Wilkes-Barre that happened. Let me take the judge's situation.
I got your answer.
This is the old Kids
You
for
ready for the
Cash
answer?
thing,
What's
which,
the
by
answer?
the way, I've always resented the Kids for Cash moniker. I think,
All right, let me answer your
I think
question.
it's inaccurate.
Let me answer
There's
your
a
question.
book in itself.
Let me answer your question. I came out of a good career, and I came out with my integrity intact, and they all knew it. And I went up to the office in the second floor of our home in the Hill section, and I doubled down on my own practices. I meditate. I'm a long-time practicing martial artist. I increased my training. I did more Qigong, Chinese breathing and stretching. I lit more incense. I sat in the Zen garden. I did all those monastic kinds of behaviors to help with my discipline and my strength. And then I went right up into that office every single day like a job, and I wrote. I put together 3 manuscripts in less than a year and a half. The first, a memoir about journalism that covered all of what you're talking about. And it's worth reading, and it's a good memoir about local journalism with some national implications because I did cover the Michael Jackson trial. I was out for the first week of the OJ trial. And then I sent my queries to publishers, to agents in New York and California,
Literary.
elsewhere.
Yep.
And nobody was interested. I talked with a cameraman who came into Wilkes-Barre just about 6 months ago. The Weather Channel's actually expanding into true crime. And believe it or not, the murder of Betty Walsifer back in August 30th, 1986, still commands attention, nationwide and worldwide. And the Weather Channel has a crew that wanted to talk with me and Jack Tasker, Betty's brother. And I said to Jack, I have put off for years talking to these increasingly entertainment-based true crime television stories. But I said, Jack, if we don't talk to this one, somebody else is, and they're going to get the story wrong. So we did talk to them, and that'll be on maybe in October. But anyway, I told them the story of the memoir about journalism. And the guy looked at me and he laughed and he said, you know what? He said, with all the interest that you hear nationally about local journalism, the importance of local journalism, everybody says they love local journalism and they're interested in local journalism, but they're not interested in the local journalist. And I thought, that guy has it right. So they didn't want that. Maybe another time. I then sat down and I wrote a novel called Paddy's Day in Trump Town. And it was about Wilkes-Barre, and it was about the Irish, and it was about the white working class and how they went for Donald Trump. And it is a stunning novel. And I shot that around. Nobody wants to read a novel about Wilkes-Barre. Nobody wants to read a novel about Scranton. That's what they told me. If they told me anything, usually I was ignored. Then I sat down and I drew from almost 5 years on the Central Coast and wine country and everything from motorcycle outlaws. And I threw that together, and of all the books that I didn't think would get the interest of a
one got-
Great
small
story.
independent
That's
publishing
a
house.
great story,
This
isn't
is the one that the
The one
publisher
that was a
wanted to publish.
throwaway.
It wasn't really a throwaway.
No, but you thought that
I
this would
thought
get
that
the least
journalism-
attention.
In context, yeah.
And with the
yeah.
context of everything, the enemy, I called it the enemy of the people. Because if that's what somebody wants to consider me to be, that's what I am. The enemy of the bad people. That's me, Corbett.
Well, I can understand. I guess it depends. There was obviously some success with, they say you paint houses.
Yes.
But of course,
yes,
now
Charlie Brandt.
that did have national implications.
Yes.
And I wrote
Yes.
extensively about some of the very people that Charlie Brandt wrote about, including Russell Bufalino, the all-time notorious mafia boss.
Yeah.
And I told Charlie Brandt my own personal story of how when Russell Bufalino, maybe the mafia boss of all mafia bosses, living in Kingston, was finally released from a federal penitentiary. And I had never met him. I knew guys who knew him, who dealt with him. And I was driving down, I think it was Durant Street in Kingston, where he lived, right after he was released from the federal penitentiary. And who was sitting in front of his house in a wheelchair with a blanket over his lap? Russell. And I had a black double-breasted suit, I had sunglasses on, and I was driving a black Blazer, and I thought, I can't let this opportunity go by. And I pulled right over to the
Absolutely.
curb, very abruptly. I got out, and I made a beeline across the street to Russell. And he looked up, and his eyes got this big, and I thought, oh no, he thinks I'm there to shoot him. I think I'm a
Thought it
hitman.
was a hit.
Because I came that way. And I said, no, Mr. Bufalino, it's okay. And I got down on my knee, and I patted his arm. And I said, you knew some people I knew, and back when boxing was big, my dad was a fighter, and he was a state trooper, and his brother, and he sighed this big sigh of relief. And his wife, I forget her name, came behind him, and I spoke to her, and she pointed to him behind his back, and she said to me, he's depressed. And I stayed kneeling, and I said, you know, Mr. Bufalino, you're here at home, the sun's shining, you're with your family, and you have every reason to feel good about being alive. And I didn't mean it that way, but he understood, and he smiled. He couldn't speak. He had had a stroke,
Yeah,
and he couldn't
yeah,
speak.
yeah.
So I told Charlie Brandt that story, and Charlie said, that's a great story. That's local. That's a local story. And I wrote about some of the other fringe players, we'll say, who associated themselves with the mob. I wrote about the mafia quite a bit.
It's amazing. Our time is just about up. One more time on the release of the book. And you mentioned First Friday.
Friday.
Yeah,
Steve.
we're dropping the book. The book ought to be available for sale on Amazon, Barnes & Noble websites, Aventura Press, Avventura. Aventura Press is publishing the book. They're a small, traditional, independent publisher.
And the latest technology, you told me everything on demand now.
That's right.
Zero waste on demand.
So the book will be available hopefully October 1st. On October 5th, 5, we're having a book party, a book launch in downtown Scranton at a location to be disclosed as the
But
date
that'll be
draws
during
near.
First Friday,
During
so-
the First Friday activities. So everybody who wants to read and think and get provoked about the issues we need to read and think and get provoked about, Blood Red Syrah is the title. And
Steve,
it's a
thanks
tough,
for joining
tough
us.
book.
Good
And
to
we'll-
see you again.
We'll talk
Good
about
to
the
see
next
you both.
Pizza King's location.
I also
too.
have a follow-up to this book called Mafia Beauty Queen. That's coming up.
There it is.
I do.
Steve Corbett joins us, and Rusty Fender.
Thanks,
and
Steve.
I think Rusty will be handling the helm himself next week. I've got a little medical procedure to be handled, and hopefully that'll be all taken care of.
Good luck, Dave. Break a
Thank
leg
you,
on
sir.
that.
Mark McGlory, thanks for
Thank
keeping
you,
us
Mark.
in focus. I'm David DeCosmo for ECTV Live. Until I see you again next week, or the week after, here's hoping all your news is good.